So, I was alerted to the prospect of what's this? Britain producing a coin to honor Gandhi recently. And the interesting thing about this particular story as I dove into it is that on the surface, it doesn't necessarily seem like a bad idea. I mean, we all know that Mahatma Gandhi was he was an important individual, very important historical figure. He led, I believe, according to this particular story, India to become an independent nation of the British Empire at his time. And he did so through nonviolent means. Gandhi was most famous for essentially being a pacifist. So pacifist, in fact, um, that, you rose a hand to him, he would never strike back. Ever. And he lived his entire life that way. That's not necessarily something I want for myself, but I can respect an individual who has that much self discipline to do what he did in that particular regard. Uh, he was an important historical figure. Um, no one's going to deny that. The problem from this particular story and this initiative comes from the fact that the individuals trying to champion this are trying to do so to advocate for um, contributions to history done by blacks, Asians, and other ethnic minorities. To which I have to wonder what's going through these people's minds, because the individuals who are championing this in the first place, trying to push forward this initiative, don't understand what it is that Gandhi actually stood for, because the individuals in question do so with threats of violence. That is not what Gandhi stood for in this instance. This is effectively another case where these groups are trying to push forward an agenda and do so under the guise of something that, everybody can look at and say, not really a problem with. Again, the statement Black Lives Matter, nobody has a problem with. The movement itself is a problem. Same thing here. It's a bunch of people trying to look at British history and try to make amends for the problem there. No, for the love of God. It is a good idea to look back at history, recognize where you screwed up, and say that was not our best moment. We can be better than this. And then going forward, be better than that. That's what history is meant. That's what history is meant for. That is why the saying goes, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. And boy, oh boy, is history, effectively trying to repeat itself. Again, we have seen the comparisons between um, these rioters and terrorists who, advocate for peaceful protesting for the change they want, and in truth, they're, violently suppressing people who speak out against them, and they threaten violence unless they necessarily get their way. We've seen this before in history. The 1930s brown shirts who brought about the rise of Nazi Germany. Yeah, that's what's going on with these riots. Is that this is effectively a return of the Nazi brown shirts, and the thing is that it's done by people who think it's okay to punch a Nazi. Look, Nazis themselves were bad people. Yes, nobody is disputing that. But the problem is that you're going around calling everybody a Nazi without understanding what a Nazi actually is. It's really ironic because the Nazis themselves were the National Socialists in Germany. So for those who are advocating for socialism are Nazis of the current modern time. Because that is effectively what Nazis are, is that they were the Nationalist Socialist Party of Germany at the time. And you're going to hear people, talk about, oh, that wasn't, socialism isn't real Nazism. We heard the same thing with communism. That wasn't real communism. No, dude. That's what Nazi quite literally was shorthand for. I'm not actually sure of what the full-on pronunciation of that was. Um, but that's what it was. Nazi Germany was a socialist dictatorship. And the interesting thing is, it falls all the way back towards the no true Scotsman fallacy. And we'll get into that in a minute. Because the other thing I want to talk about in regards to history repeating itself is effectively, America has started its second civil war. It is the Boogaloo has already effectively started. When did it start? It started the day that a bunch of the rioters effectively stormed a federal courthouse and seized control of it. I think they did so for a little bit. They managed to get onto the property and take control, and that's why additional Fed troops were deployed and all that. Need I remind you, that's how the original Civil War started. You had a bunch of Confederates storm Fort Sumter in Charlottesville. No. Charleston. That's what I'm thinking of. Charleston, South Carolina, was a fairly it's a fairly big harbor town in South Carolina. And back in the day, you had pirates attacking it regularly. So Fort Sumter was designed to be a naval base to defend against that. And a bunch of Southerners who were, got together, and it was like traitors of the Union Army got together, and as the Confederate Army, they attacked Fort Sumter while it was still under construction, while it still had just a very small token garrison force, and seized it. They effectively seized federal property. And when Lincoln said, hey, give this back, the Confederates said, ha 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 ha, come and take it. And that's how the Civil War effectively kicked off. We saw the same thing with the whole courthouse. Is the rioters attacked federal property, seized control of it, and when the federal government said, "No, you can't do that, give it back," the rioters said, "Ha ha ha, come and take it," and that's exactly why the federal troops deployed and kicked him off that property. It's amazing that people are effectively blind to these sorts of things, willingly blind to the repeats of history. The thing about the Civil War is that we had all those statues and monuments to remind us to be better, remind us what happened so that we would more likely look into it and remember and not repeat it. Not repeat, the things that led up to that. Remind us that we should not return to slavery. Remind us of what happened to cause brother to turn against brother in the still to date the bloodiest conflict in American history. More lives were lost, American lives were lost in the American Civil War than any other conflict. Even both world wars, the casualty counts for Americans is still today less than the American Civil War. It's a frightening thing. Um, yeah, and it's apparently part of the plan that is going on with these maniacs is to eliminate history that is otherwise unfavorable to them. You know, they're tearing down all these statues and whatnot. You know, saying that they honored slavery and the like and everything, and they've torn down. That started with the Confederate statues. Now they've started moving on to, um, the founding fathers, which is insane because a lot of them, that they did own slaves, but at the same time, it is suppose not as well known because apparently people don't pay attention to history that some of the founding fathers tried to sneak in clauses to start to end slavery. And the only reason that didn't necessarily get tossed out the window as soon as America was founded was because of the southern states. They relied on that manpower. But the truth is that with the industrialization that was going on, because it the era that the Civil War kind of took place in was leading up to the Industrial Revolution in America. All the agriculture that was formerly done by just hand-picked manpower was starting to be replaced by the earliest semblances of mechanized farming. Food for thought on that instance. Slavery would have been already going out the door in that instance, and then we had a whole big fight about it, and we decided, yeah, you know what? It's bad. Let's go ahead and abolish it, and actually get working Americans in there to help stimulate the economy. Because this is all interlinked in that particular instance. Alrighty. Doubling back to what I said something earlier about the no true Scotsman fallacy. That particular fallacy goes along the lines of, no true X condones Y. And we're seeing a lot of this on both sides. Yeah, you see a lot of it on the Democratic side, the left-hand side, the liberals, especially the far ones. Talking about who the true racists are, who the true sexists are, who the true intolerant bigots are, and it's funny because it's a purity spiral on that end. And actually, I had my own confrontation regarding this, regarding a couple people on on the right. So I hate to admit this, but I think a few of my left-leaning people I know may have a bit of a point about the crazies on the right. That there is something there. Because I kind of got into this whole spat with well, here's the overall story. It was another YouTuber by the name of Mr. Obvious. He does a lot of other content in this particular regard, satiring a lot of the stories that come out as well. And it was a community post he made. And out of the blue, I was looking through some of the comments, as I usually tend to do. Well, these days I don't even find I have the patience to look through these comments anymore. And just read to watch the videos and more read the comments and everything. It's a little bit more quicker and informative for me. And, out of the blue, just kind of out of nowhere, you had one of these actually intolerant individuals come out of nowhere talking about, how homophobia is, how homosexuality is bad, it's abnormal, and we need to, stomp it out and everything. And I kind of looked at this guy like he's a fucking maniac. And there were a couple people that chimed in on his side, and all of them, claimed to be followers of the true Christian faith and whatnot. And it's one of those things I'll get into, but one of my personal beliefs is, one thing that makes Christianity better than some of the other religions is that we're willing to call out our crazies. Yeah, there was the whole evangelical thing going on about towards between the 50s and the 80s and whatnot. But I can only speak for myself, but I'm pretty sure a lot of people may agree with this as well. Is that, speaking as a Christian, I'm willing to call out the hateful in this particular regard. Yeah. If you look through the Bible, there is a whole lot of talk about intolerance of homosexuality. It's seen as a sin, blah 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 blah. But at the same time, the this is where the kind of the atheists I think have a point. There is that the one of the teachings of Christianity itself is to love people. And I'm not claiming to be a perfect Christian. No way in shape, hell, or form. So I'm not that devout. I don't really follow everything to the letter in that instance. But I think that's one thing I can necessarily agree on, is that if you're gonna rile yourself up into a tizzy, hating an individual for something they can't control, and as somebody who does believe in science as well, biological sciences, just from looking at things and what I've seen, homosexuals can't help what they are. Is it natural? No. It's it's uh it's it's a malfunction of some sorts of the body's processes regarding attraction and everything else. But considering all sorts of other mutations and defects and other sorts of other things, it's fairly benign because barring any other defects, you know, there really isn't anything inherently too bad about homosexuality. It's just a defect like so many others. Which is the question that I pose to these individuals. Um, if you would preach hate against somebody with a physical deformity, you know, okay, I'm kind of getting that backwards a little bit. If you preach hate towards somebody with a mental defect, how is that any different than preaching hate towards somebody with a physical one? It's things that are not necessarily in your control, and that's just another thing altogether regarding, not only homosexuality but also transgenderism, transsexuals, yeah, that sort of thing. For those who are legitimately affected by it, it's a defect. It's not one they can necessarily, control. And I think, as a civilized, moral individual, we need to help these people. And I'm not saying, we need to go in and correct the defect to make them normal. Like those with physical disabilities, we have a duty to help them live their lives in a way that's comfortable to them. Because I'm gonna be honest, and again, this kind of dates back to my own hatred of psychology and uh, psychiatry, that sort of thing. But when you deny people an aspect, if you deny people the ability to be their true selves, it's gonna cause some real problems down the line, mentally and physically, in some ways. So, if they're not hurting anybody, I say let them live. And this is the stance I took in regards to these conservative individuals. And they immediately fired back on me, saying, no true conservative would tolerate things like homosexuality. Which is which was funny. So I kind of turned around on him and I said, "All right, let's take a look at what conservatism is actually defined as." Now, and I did the whole thing where I break it down. I'll even do it here. So we have conservatism. Uh, conserve essentially means to preserve as is. Preserve using sugars, other sorts of things. You're trying to conserve something as it is. And then ism. I actually looked this one up as well. Like I said, in addition to prejudice for or against, actually turns out that it's a belief of. So you have a belief in conserving something as it is. And when you combine the two, that's the hard definition. But since we have the word now, we can refine it a little bit, and it's the ideals and beliefs of the Conservative Party, which in a nutshell is lower taxes, less government and less governmental regulations, a strong national defense, and personal fiscal responsibility. Again, going back to the whole thought experiment in communism and why capitalism works better for the individual. Uh, being responsible for your own finances, securing your own resources, that is an ideal of conservatism. And the one key factor here is that conservatism itself is resistant to change. It doesn't like hard, sudden change. If change must happen, it should be done gradually. That's one of the tenets there. And the hilarious thing is that these individuals doubled even harder down on it, stating that the definition I gave wasn't, true classical conservatism. That was, supposedly defined by, it's by an individual during the French Revolution, and the individual in question went on to talk about how the French Revolution was so liberal, and yelling at me that my thought experiment that I handed to him regarding conservatism, shouldn't count in any way, shape, or form. And I'll get into that thought experiment for you in a minute here. But going on and ranting about the whole thing. And I sat back and I said, all right, so you claim that as well, but this is the definition that I pulled together, and I gave him the examples of the word there. And I told him, and I said, one could also make the argument that the French Revolution was also conservative in nature. Because why did the French Revolution happen? It came on the end of the 7 Years' War, where France lost horribly to England, so there goes your strong national defense. The people didn't have faith in their military anymore. The French aristocracy and monarchy was effectively taxing people to death. So there's your high taxes, lower. The people want lower taxes. That's why they overthrew the monarchy in the first place. And then again, the aristocracy and the monarchy governs every aspect of the peasants' lives. So less government, less regulation, more, more individual responsibilities for personal finances. If you had wealth, you should be personally responsible for it for yourself. The only aspect that one could make that the French Revolution was not conservative in nature, and I'll concede this point, is that the change happened extremely drastically and extremely radically. It was a very violent, sudden revolution that just happened. And then, they wanted to overthrow the monarchy, get rid of it, so that they could have, their lower taxes. They could have the government interfering in less local affairs, more private businesses, less regulation, and responsibility for one's personal wealth, because the wealth isn't all being taken up by the government, and a strong national defense. People looked to Napoleon to lead the way through the French Revolution, because he was an advocate for a strong national defense. And we can go on and on about how Napoleon proved this by making the French empire that he created unstoppable, until he wasn't. The loss at Waterloo is effectively the biggest stain on his career. But until that point, that was definitely, I would say, a great example of a strong national defense. So yeah, I mean, oh yeah, the thought experiment that I actually threw at these individuals as to why their views on homosexuality is actually liberal. Yes, the intolerance of homosexuality is a liberal concept as opposed to a conservative one. And hear me out on this. This is a thought experiment for you. Back in the days of the Bronze Age, where you had, everything was kind of focused around the Mediterranean. That's where world history was at the time. Back in the day, monogamy was, it wasn't necessarily normal per se. It was more of a luxury than really a good. The truth is that there was a lot of polygamous and polyamory relationships. The orgies of Greece, the orgies of Rome, that sort of thing. And homosexuality was not only tolerated, it was encouraged, especially as a military tradition. The belief was that if the men in the military engaged in those kinds of homoerotic homosexual relationships, they would fight harder in combat to protect their loved ones, and they would more likely often than not win. That was their belief. And considering, the many battles of Greece and how long Greece stood as kind of an empire, maybe there was some kind of truth to that. So in truth, homosexuality not only being tolerated but encouraged is a very old military tradition that dates all the way back to the Bronze Age. So, yeah, that essentially came first, and then the thing is that monogamy and homosexuality as a sin was not really considered the norm until about the medieval ages or the Victorian era. Essentially, the stance that it was a sin, immoral, and needed to be stomped out and destroyed, um, basically coincides with the rise of the Catholic Church, and that particular doctrine becoming dominant in Europe. This was also about the time that there was a rise in monogamy as well, that it was being processed as the norm. So as, the Catholic Church became a dominant force in Europe and world history starts shifting towards the Europe side of things, where things are happening, we have um, written histories regarding that. You get that. And because looking at that in the long term, intolerance towards homosexuality, especially in the military, including the modern no fraternization rule of today, is a change from the old military tradition. So the whole intolerance toward homosexuality and the rise of it being seen as an abnormal thing. And again, by science, it is an abnormal thing, but the tolerance of it, being intolerant of it, that's a liberal thing. That's a change. That is a change in what is considered the norm, which makes intolerance of it a liberal thing. But that's a thought experiment for you. Yeah, that the conservative view, if you look back far enough, is that homosexuality is not only tolerated but encouraged, and that the conservatism ideal states that that tradition should be kept, and the fact that it changed makes the intolerance of it a liberal view. I know. It's an interesting little thought experiment. I love these things. It's hilarious. But yeah, I mean, that these intolerant right wingers came in and they started claiming the whole no true conservatism believes that and yada yada yada, and it was just the most amusing and sobering thing to watch. And I even turned right back around to one of them who was kind of going off on me about willing to open up a dialogue with the individuals on the left, saying how useless it was and that we should just, you know, put him down and kill him and not even bother talking to him. And I, kept going on about, as a civil individual, I have to at least try. Make no mistake. The insane individuals on the far left, um, they can't really be reasoned with, but I still have to try. That still doesn't mean that if they're willing to do violence against me, I'm going to hold back. I am going to be willing to do violence against them. If they want to fight, they'll get one. That's necessarily what I believe in, and I've stated beforehand regarding my beliefs on defending the common individual as a service member. But I'm also reminded of one of the speeches from Doctor Who about the scale model of war, and there is also some truth to that, because when talks break down, there is going to be violence. And when the dust settles, we got to go right back to the table and do what we should have done beforehand, sit down and talk. So when the dust settles and I have dispensed with the violence, I have to be willing to sit down and talk with whomever is left. The left does not share this ideal. And neither did this individual who professed themselves to be, a true conservative. And so I kind of looked at him and said, this is kind of an irony here, boy, because by your own admission, by your own belief that I should not bother wasting my time sitting down and talking with people who don't agree with me, that I should just kill people who disagree with me, means that I should turn around and kill you for daring to disagree with me. So, yeah. In professing no true conservatism, they are a scarily mirror image of the intolerance and screeching of the far left. Ah, I know. But the same way that I am a believer in that as a Christian, I should call out the bad Christians. It's the same thing with conservatives. I do believe in many conservative ideals more heavily than I do whatever the left is handing out. Doesn't mean that I, would consider myself a good or even a solid or even uh, what they would define as a true conservative. I do hold liberal views on a certain number of things, and tolerance of homosexuality. It's one of them. Hate the sin, love the sinner deal. And even then, I'm not perfect. I've had people wrong me before in the past personally, and to this day, I still hold hatred, and I still can't forgive them. But that's a personal story for another time. So, yeah. But I saw that story regarding Gandhi, and I'm like, no, this is another smokescreen operation. This is people trying to hide behind the deeds of a good person who did amazing things and use him as a shield for their actions. No, I'm gonna call you out on this. Gandhi, he was somebody to respect, and what he did, his accomplishments, are indeed worthy of admiration and respect. But the best way to honor that is to teach what he did and what he believed in. Don't just sit there and give him a coin, pat yourselves on the back, and call it a day. Teach what he did. Teach his beliefs. The greatest honor that you can give an individual like that is ensuring that their memory lives on. That is the greatest honor that you can give an individual. Don't give a useless commemoration. And to the individuals, hiding behind this, I see what you're doing. I know what you're doing. No, fuck off. You don't deserve to use him as your personal shield. He was a pacifist to the core, and he advocated for change without violence. That's not what you boys are doing. That's not what you idiots are doing. Because you, every time something doesn't go your way, you promise violence. And then you promise more violence when it stops. No, I'm calling you out. Remember Gandhi and his teachings. Don't shield yourself with useless commemorations of what he did. But of course, as I've said before, these individuals are not going to listen to any sort of reason. They don't want to talk in a Discord. That's a topic for another time, so odds are I'm just screaming into the void on this.